welcome to our next lecture, our unit over Romanticism, Realism, and Impressionism. So our first lecture is over Romanticism. Let's recap and go back to the last century, where we discussed the Rococo and this very frivolous, pastel-colored, loose brushstrokes, depictions of the aristocracy, which coincides with the Enlightenment and the ideas in which led to numerous revolutions across the globe, where people were questioning this divine right to rule, where the people rose up, they demanded a say in their government, etc., to get rid of the corruption of these elite nobles, which coincides with Neoclassicism, 1760s to 1850s. We had the first French Revolution, where the royal family was executed, and we ended with Napoleon seizing power. So what happens next, which we'll get into, is that another king comes about to control France, and he is part of the same Bourbon line that the previous one was part of. And we have another revolution, which coincides with Romanticism and Realism. So we often think of these styles as linear, that one happens and then the next one happens, and that it's very easy to define these dates. But if you'll notice, Neoclassicism overlaps with Romanticism, just slightly, but that these are happening at the same time, and there's some experimentation at first, followed by Realism. So let's discuss neoclassical artworks. We have our hierarchy of paintings, in which history paintings is at the top of the hierarchy, as defined by the French Academy. And so neoclassical art depicts history paintings, particularly classical history, such as we see here with the Oath of the Hirashi. We have this very heroic story of these three brothers who are going to battle to save their state, their country. We have this very defined picture plane, our nice centrally placed figure, our orthogonal lines leading to a vanishing point. We have our classical architecture, classical clothing, idealized figure style, classical just throughout this entire painting with very tight brush strokes. It's also a shallow space. The viewer is right up against the picture plane. Consider how that started in the previous style with Baroque. And these tight, crisp brush strokes. And I point that out so much because the next few styles will play with that. And we talked about how Napoleon created his empire. And so here's Napoleon crossing the Alps from 1801, one of 5 versions. And it's extremely propagandistic. So it's our neoclassical aspect with our tight brush strokes. It's a history painting, albeit contemporary, and it is propaganda. His size is exaggerated because no person is this large on a horse, but it's showing him in control and riding off into battle, crossing the Alps. So we're under the Napoleonic Empire, and Napoleon reached into countries that many people have never heard of. And so here we see this depiction in Syria. Many people in Europe hadn't heard of that. And so you read about this idea of Orientalism. And so it's this really common name for describing the East. And it's very exotic in that regard. What we have with Romanticism, or let me back up. So Romanticism started as a literary genre. And it's very emotional and it's very imaginative. So much so that Napoleon actually outlawed it as a literary genre because he wanted more control over the people. And so the more emotional and imaginative they are, that would challenge his reign, essentially. Consider the Enlightenment was all about these ideas and imagining a better world. And so he outlaws it, but of course this just makes it a little more popular. And so this transfers into art. And so here we have an example of Romanticism. And Napoleon had, like I said, he had reached into Syria. So consider the Islamic elements we see throughout here. Here's our French flags. The troops had taken over. And here's another example of propaganda for Napoleon Bonaparte. So his troops had gone into Syria, and the story is that the plague hit. And he either left behind these French troops to die, or there's some stories about how he had his troops that were infected with the plague killed, so as not to spread it more. Either way, the story makes it back to France, and of course people are outraged. Their young men are fighting Napoleon, being sent off to war, and here he kills his own men. And so this artwork was produced as a means of propaganda to help calm this tension and this outrage against Napoleon. The story is that he went back to Syria to help care for the French troops. And so we see that depicted here. I'm using this a little bit as a transition piece because we have our centrally placed figure, we have this history painting, but then consider how extremely different this is compared to the Oath of Hirashi, or even his crossing the Alps. This is a much more chaotic scene. We have many, many bodies, and they're all in these different poses. Okay, consider the different poses of this guy leaning over, all of them. That this artist is showing off his ability to depict the human body in an array of different poses as well as emotions. Even this deceased gentleman here. But Napoleon is taking care of his troops so much that he even reaches over and touches the wound of this plague victim. Of course, that didn't happen, but we have propaganda being used here. But what else is different is we have these much looser brush strokes. Okay, we don't have the tight, crisp lines that we saw with the neoclassical artworks that we were looking at. So here's our peek into Romanticism. And in fact, let's come back to a neoclassical artwork that we looked at, the Portrait of Madeleine, and this allegory of France, this commentary on slavery in which Napoleon had reinstated, and how she's in this regal pose of sitting upright, and how she likely represents the French people with the red, the white, and the blue. Remember, our Jean-Louis David had created this new flag for the new France. So back here, in which Napoleon kept for France. And then here is a transition piece, a really famous transition piece we're going to discuss. Notice the similar elements with this turban wrapped, the nude female, the gaze, looking directly at the viewer, emphasis on the cloth, etc. And so let's transition into Romanticism, from neoclassical to romantic. Romanticism, not romantic. So there are some elements that are familiar to us. We have some tenebrism, this darker background. We have a nude female, classical, think back to our Aphrodite of Knidos, etc. And we have our crisp brush strokes. Look at the details of this cloth. I mean, you can imagine how it feels even. The details of all these different textures, be it the pearls, the gold, the different types of fabrics. But what's different? So this is not a history painting. There's no heroic act occurring here. No grand leader, even with that other Napoleon piece. We have a female lounging about in the nude and looking at the viewer. So what we have here, though, are these elements of Orientalism. So this is a depiction of a female in a Turkish harem. So the Turkish harem is in Turkey. I went to Istanbul and visited the palace. And part of the tour is you go through this whole massive section, this very grand section of the palace, and that was the harem. And so this is where the Sultan's concubines would be. Their eunuchs were the only males that were allowed near these females to protect them. And so these concubines were in this luscious palace, just awaiting time to be spent with the king. And so here we have a depiction of that. Now here's the Orientalism that comes in, because it's the very artist's rendition of what the East looks like. It's the artist's rendition of what Turkey looks like. Because if we notice her face, she does not look Turkish at all. She doesn't look like she's from the Middle East. She looks extremely European. This is not what one of our Turkish harem concubines would look like. But we do have our attempts at these Turkish elements. We have this pipe right here. We have this incense burner. We have this exotic fan with the peacocks. And of course, we have this turban, this cloth wrapped around. And so there's these oriental elements, this exotic appeal that's coming through. What's also different, though, is the proportions of the body. Look at how long her spine is. This does not make sense, especially considering the end of her spine to the end of her rear. We have some mannerist elements coming through here, even the length of her arm. And then look at this leg. Where's this leg does not make sense. This is not the correct position of if it were to be extending from her hip. And so we have these questions, these challenges to the neoclassical work that we've seen. We still have our type brushstrokes, but this is considered a transition piece because of the romantic elements of the Orientalism and of the imagination that's incorporated into this. Again, the artist's rendition of the East, as well as it's challenging these neoclassical ideals. It's not a history painting. There's nothing heroic. And of course, her proportions are off. So Ong, it looks like Ingress, but it's the French Ong, is a very famous painter. And this is a very famous painting. Here we are up close. So elements that are familiar and elements that are new. So here is Henry Fuseli's The Nightmare. And I want to introduce this. It's a little bit, from before, it's 1781. But this is the first known portrait of our subconscious. So it's this psychological portrayal. And it's called The Nightmare. And it's depicting the nightmare. We have this weird demonic looking horse peeking out from the cloth behind, the tenebrism elements, the spotlight of Baroque that we had seen before. But we have some looser brush strokes. And we have this weird demon atop her, which is a succubi. And so there was this popular story of these demons attacking women in their sleep. And so here we have her sprawled out, neck exposed. She's vulnerable, but it's this depiction of a nightmare. And so it's really this idea of imagination coming through and the subconscious and analyzing the mind. So we aren't having any neoclassical epic story or any neoclassical history story here. Instead, it's an analysis of imagination, of a dream. And those elements come through with our romanticism. It's this exaggerated artist rendition that's emotionally evocative. You cower in fear at these demonic elements, as well as you are concerned about this vulnerable female. And so they're meant to impact you emotionally. Just like with this one, it's meant to impact you emotionally to garner favor for Napoleon. Feel bad for our French troops, but know that Napoleon is there to take care of them. Come back to our Oriental elements of this artistic rendition. But things are extremely chaotic. One other thing to point out with Romanticism, there's often a naked dude in almost all of them. So an indicator. But these twisting, writhing bodies and the chaotic mass of people. Napoleon's empire ends in 1815. Along that line, Bourbon kings come back, essentially. Charles X, so that's of the Bourbon family, with Louis XVI, who had been executed. And he goes so far as to get rid of that French flag that we knew. He reinstates the coat of arms of his family. You think the French would have learned, they already deposed one king. But here we have, the reinstatement of another king, which of course leads to another revolution, which unfortunately does not work out well. So here we are with the Géricault's La Balsa de la Medusa, so the Raft of the Medusa, 1818 to 19. At this point, the Bourbon king is back in power, or a new one, but of the same line. And of course, we have the similar corrupt issues that we had before. I think they would have learned. So this is the story of the Raft, or of the Medusa. We have a history painting, but before we go into the story about this, let's consider how different this is than our neoclassical artworks. It's a contemporary history painting. So this is over an event that had just occurred. It has much looser brush strokes. We don't have our tight, crisp lines. We have a much more chaotic composition. We have many, many writhing bodies. They're all in these different twisting poses. And there's a much more emphasis on nature, right? Consider the storm that's going on beyond them. There's starting to be this idea of nature versus man, which we'll see play out for the next couple styles. So here we have the Raft of the Medusa. This is a massive painting. Remember, with our hierarchy of paintings, the history of paintings are extremely large. And so the Raft of the Medusa is technically a history painting, albeit a contemporary historical event. And so it's extremely large. In fact, let me get ahead of myself. Sorry. Oh, no. Here is a depiction of it in a salon versus other Medusas. Okay. So the Medusa was a slave ship. And it was captained by this gentleman who had absolutely no experience and who was an example of nepotism. Under this new Bourbon king, he basically was, assigning his friends to these high positions. And so he assigns one guy to be the captain of the ship. Didn't have any experience whatsoever with leading a ship. And so he was told that he needed to reclaim this French colony. There were over 400 people there, settlers, soldiers, etc. And he's supposed to go capture them because there were uprisings going on, or to go help them. And so he sends the ship, and of course, when anyone who has no idea what they're doing, what happens, and in typical fashion, there also aren't enough lifeboats. So they ordered the carpenters to start to create these rafts as the ship was going down. And so we see these pieces of the ship quickly chopped off to create these rafts. And while he and the other, elite board the lifeboats. And so they, run aground. Many people die as the ship goes down. But they attach these man-made rafts to the actual lifeboats that the captain and his elite men are on. But these rafts are slowing them down. So what does he do? He cuts off the rope that this raft was attached to. And so he leaves these men essentially to die. This caused a massive uproar. It became a very well-known story. And so what we see here is kind of the crescendo of this experience. We have this massive, this wide range of emotions and poses and people. So this took 3 years for our artist. And in fact, he interviews the survivors because this is our peak moment where they're about to be rescued. And we see this ship off in the far distance. And so he interviewed the survivors. It took him 3 years to create this. He studied bodies in the morgue to determine how to depict deceased bodies, a range of emotions, etc. I'll consider that to our compare it to our previous, examples of martyrs versus neoclassical. And this is an example of it's anti-heroic. We don't have this, epic Hirashi brothers who, were willing to sacrifice their lives for the good of the, etc., to save everyone else. We have a terrible story of nepotism in which many lives were lost, of this, similar French king. But what we also have here is the slave is the hero. So in this triangular composition, which is off-center, it's not like our neoclassical centrally placed, focal point. Instead, we have here is this slave, our hero, where he is the one at the topmost of this pyramid, raising the flag, trying to get the attention of this ship in the distance. And so it's another commentary on slavery, which had still been, was obviously still going on. And he's putting the African as the hero here. Not your typical, Osashi, Roman story, etc. So it's another comedy. And this is extremely emotionally evocative in numerous aspects, be it from, mourning the death of, these people who many died horrendously, to a commentary on slavery, as well as the power and majesty of nature surrounding them. This man versus nature. These aspects of enlightenment are coming through. So the commentary on the corruption of the king. We have, no monarchy. You can't have faith you can't have faith in any monarchy. The failure of the revolution is apparent. The failure of the ideas of the Enlightenment. And so there's also this, pessimistic attitude of what's going on. One critic during the time period even said, we're all on the raft Medusa. And so it was this idea that everyone is going down under this, failure that's culminated in another Bourbon king. So, emotional aspects of this painting are extremely indicative of Romanticism, where there's this spontaneity of these individual feelings. And they've rejected the Enlightenment in this age of reason that essentially ended up in a failure to them because they have another king. And instead, they're going to focus on these emotional aspects, the idea that feelings and intuition are more important than reason. The individual freedoms are important, that the artists have the freedom to depict these emotions. Artists have the freedom to depict different subject matter than what was established under the Neoclassical, hierarchy of the French Academy. And so we see that throughout here, objective manner. The viewer is supposed to be extremely emotionally impacted, especially when we consider one of the focal points of this gentleman leaning against his fist. He's older. His arm is wrapped atop this younger man who has just died. And the argument is that this was his son. Okay, so he had interviewed the survivors of this raft. He even studied the depictions he studied the raft and the plans that were, kept to show the nepotism and, terrible actions of the king. And so you have these writhing bodies, this deceased gentleman, they have this, wet foot, this rotting skin, this gentleman, man's almost halfway in the water. This other guy's off. These twisting bodies as they reach toward our, hero who is calling upon the ship in the distance to save them. And so there's this emphasis on emotion to encourage criticism of the king. And the new path to freedom is through imagination, not reason, because that didn't work out the first time. So there's this desire for freedom, not only political, but, for thoughts, feelings, actions, etc. Here's the plan after the Medusa at the moment of rescue. These two pyramidal composition elements. He spent 3 years creating this study. Preparatory sketch. He had traveled to Rome, where he looked at the Last Judgment. Once I point that out, you can tell where he's influenced by it. He even said, Michelangelo sent shivers up my spine. These lost souls, destroying each other, inevitably conjure up the tragic grandeur of the Sistine Chapel. So there were arguments, or there were stories of cannibalism on this ship as well, in order to survive. And so it's really showing, the darkness of man. We even see that with the color palette. Okay. Here is Eugene Delacroix, very famous painting, Liberty Leading the People. So here's liberty, an allegory for liberty, just like our Statue of Liberty, which came from the French. And so here she is holding the French flag. Remember that the Bourbon king had gotten rid of. He reinstated his coat of arms as the official flag. And so she carries it, leading the people of all ages and walks of life, from this, young street urchin to this, kind of more, or this gentleman with the top hat off, we have this other gentleman who looks dirtier by comparison. He purposefully in dark and white and black to show the differences between these socioeconomic levels. Who's carrying a sword. We have all these other people, and again, our guy with no pants. He's depicting the deceased. It's a chaotic composition. We have many, bodies and all these. It's extremely dynamic. But here we have liberty leading the people. If you've ever seen Les Miserables, much of it is actually based off of this painting. But here we have our allegory, leading the people. We have our loose brush strokes. We have our technically a history painting, but it's not something heroic because this was a failed revolution, another failed revolution, in which many people died. They overthrew the king, but it doesn't, lead to the changes that they want. And it was French against French. Okay, let's head over to Spain and talk about Francisco Goya's The 3rd of May, 1808. And he created this several years later. And so here we have Spain was battling against Napoleon. Napoleon was trying to overthrow and overtake Spain before he, was deposed. And so here we have the French troops who are about to kill these gentlemen. We see the dead body, and we see this gentleman. So we have a depiction of a martyr. However, this, like the other French examples, led to nothing. There was no epic, story in which they gained their freedom. Actually, the 3rd of May, because the day before was 2nd of May, where there was an attempted uprising. These are the Moorish troops that are battling with the French. And this uprising resulted in failure. And so the people who were part of it are then killed the following day. They're lined up by the French troops. Now he's wearing white, so that color is considered the position of his hands and how this is reminiscent of Christ on the cross. We have the spotlight on him, an extremely exaggerated spotlight. However, nothing comes from this. There's no savior. There's no, none of these gentlemen go down in history as saving Spain. So it's anti-heroic again. A commentary on this corruption and on death. Notice how the French troops, he purposely doesn't show any of their faces. Instead, the focal point, the central, placement of the guns is emphasized, and how they're almost kind of these, they lack humanity. They're more along the lines of like beans with the metals that are facing toward these people who are about to be shot. So the 3rd of May is a commentary on, again, another, unfortunately, a failed revolution. He had previously been a court painter versus other examples of martyrdom. Went to Benjamin West. Later with Realism, they take up this idea of, there's no hero. So he was extremely popular. He had been a court painter. Now he's, depicting scenes of the failure of the revolution, of this war between the Spaniards and the Napoleonic troops. And he's actually asked by the general in France to accompany them and depict these scenes. And so there's nothing to be done from his disastrous war series. This is an etching, so it's harder to determine the style because of the rough medium. But consider how the executioner, their faces aren't really emphasized, Instead, the deceased, or the gentleman who's about to be shot, is. And all that we see are the guns right here. So again, these, there's no humanity to these executioners. The French firing squad, they're like Auton-like executioners. Just like here. Aimed at these protesters. Rebels as martyrs, but again, this uprising was futile. It achieved nothing. And so there's this sense of human sacrifice, of human life, but in this regard for nothing. It doesn't lead to salvation. There's only tragedy. And so that's extremely different than our neoclassical heroic depictions. There's some other depictions. The horrors of war. Here's another really famous painting of his that you've likely seen or will see, Saturn devouring one of his children. This is a story of ancient classical god devouring one of his children, and it's much darker. Okay, 1819 to 1823. So consider all that he had seen. And would definitely mess with someone. But also, in 1817, he went completely deaf for for an unknown reason. And so this brings him into a very dark period. If you were completely deaf, it would be challenging not to see the darkness in that. And so he moves away and he becomes this hermit in this cottage out in the middle of the woods, and he calls it La Quinta del Sordo. He stays in this dark period. He calls it the Villa Man. He creates these black paintings, and he paints them on the interior of his house in fresco. They're detached and mounted on canvas. So these black paintings in his darkness, extremely emotionally evocative. We feel uncomfortable looking at them. We feel the darkness of it all. The darkness of the, barbarism of military conflict. Okay, so here's Joseph Mallard William Turner's Slave Ship. This will help us transition into. Let's just focus on Romanticism. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So we are Raft of the Medusa, which, by the way, when you think Romanticism, I want you to think, sorry, I'm jumping around, of the Raft of the Medusa. Okay, this is your key artwork. When you want to remember elements of Romanticism, characteristics of it, think of the Raft of the Medusa. And how we had that man versus nature. Now that's going to play out even more, especially in Great Britain. So this is our British artist, and where we have these extremely loose brush strokes. There's hardly any, clearly defined lines. We have this, epic nature scene going on. All these epic scenes are indicative of Romanticism. And initially you may see it as, it's pretty with the coloring, this appreciation for the beauty of the sea. But then once you start to see the details and acknowledge the title, Slave Ship, originally slavers throwing overboard the dead and dying, it becomes really dark. And it's another, aspect of the darkness of humanity and this commentary on slavery that's going on. We can see the chains and the bottom of the, the arm reaching out or the leg reaching out of these bodies who have been thrown overboard. It's argued that he based this off of a poem, Fallacies of Hope. Aloft all hands, strike the topmasts and belay. You angry setting sun and fierce-edged clouds, declare the typhoon's coming. Before it sweeps your decks, throw overboard the dead and dying. Never heed their chains. Hope, hope, delicious hope. Where is thy market now? Consider how the other paintings that we've looked at, there's almost a lack of hope. And none of them led to the desired outcome that they wanted with these revolutions. And so here we see a hopeless situation again. Let's head to America with Thomas Cole's The Oxbow. 1836, oil on canvas. So America is far removed from Europe. However, up until this time period, we don't have an established art school in America. And so to make it as an artist, you would travel to Europe where you would be trained, and then come back to America. However, Thomas Cole helps to create one of the first art schools, and it's called the Hudson River School. He's influenced by Romanticism, especially with these epic landscapes and this man versus nature, and he brings it to New York. So his goal with these paintings is to really capture the kind of uniqueness of America, where there's elements of Romanticism, but it's, particularly American. Here's our landscape. And so he wants to document the unspoiled landscapes of America, especially the newly added, West Oxbow changing river. So here we have the Oxbow. It was rediverted to help with the crops around, with the farmland, cultivated farmland. So there's some criticisms of Cole, and that he, one of the interpretations is when we compare this light dark and how the writes, is bathed in this ethereal light. And so he's highlighting and elevating this cultivated land, that's been chopped down and used for farmland now. However, that's inaccurate because Tom Cole explicitly wrote about this. He was criticized in Great Britain. There were many publications where they were criticizing America. We'd had, obviously the War of the Revolutionary War, then the War of 1812, and so the British keep saying, and so they're criticizing America and say that we're destroying all the land. However, Thomas Cole depicts this scene to show that there are still unspoiled aspects of nature, that there is still this grandeur of the Americas. We have this romantic landscape on the left and kind of more classical on the right, and he brings the romantic, untouched landscape closest to the view, up against the picture plane. There's this kind of juxtaposition of the wild on the left and the settled areas on the right, and this man versus nature. So he painted this actually as a reaction to a British book where they, alleged that Americans had destroyed all the wilderness with industry. But here he's showing that there is still, beautiful unspoiled land. This is our time period of manifest destiny and the potential of the continent. But he's emphasizing the wildness of nature. This is the same time period in which Henry David Thoreau is writing. And so it's this idea of transcendentalism, where out in nature you can transcend to a higher form of self and better understand the world. That there's this religious experience out in nature. And so here we have this man versus nature with this approaching storm and, this, tree that's, been partially broken, etc. The, oneness and grandeur of nature, and that we are little and insignificant by ourselves. So it's this reminder and respect for nature. In fact, he wrote about it. So, he, discussed American scenes are not destitute of historical and legendary associations. The great struggle for freedom has sank to many a spot, and many a mountain stream and rock has its legends, worthy of a poet's pen or a painter's pencil. That we should appreciate it. These are depictions of the Catskill Mountains. So he was taking a train and he would stop